We have a lot of wide receivers to get to, so I don't waste your time. Let's jump into our number one guy with Justin Jefferson. Okay, what is there to talk about? He's gotten better every single season. The man went from the wide receiver 11 to the wide receiver 4 to the wide receiver 2. He's improved his receiving yards on a per game basis from 87 to 95 to 106. I think you can make an argument that he is on pace to be the best wide receiver ever. He was the best 23-year-old wide receiver that we had ever seen in the NFL last season. He's the 101 regardless of the format that you're playing in. Unless maybe if it's a 2 QB league, then we can slide Jefferson down just a bit. But yeah, no, you're drafting Justin Jefferson number 1 overall. Now, Ja'Marr Chase is going to be right up there. I understand a lot of people are frustrated that Chase got hurt last season, and this is why you'll see in some casual redraft leagues, like people taking Austin Eckler, people taking Christian McCaffrey, hell, people even taking Cooper Kupp over Ja'Marr Chase. I think it's a massive mistake if you were doing that, to be honest, because while Chase did, quote unquote, disappoint based on him getting hurt and missing some time last year, nonetheless, if you're looking at the volume metrics that you had for Ja'Marr Chase last season, he took a massive step forward in year 2. He went from 7.5 targets per game as a rookie to over 11 targets per game as a second-year player. He had a 31% team target share with Joe Burrow. That means this next season, every time Burrow drops back, there's about a 30 to 31% chance he is throwing the ball to Ja'Marr freaking Chase. Okay, if you're getting that amount of target volume from Joe Burrow, there are very few players in fantasy football that have the same ceiling. Now, going over to our next guy, we are going to be looking at Tyreek Hill here. Now, I understand, yes, Tyreek Hill has some legal stuff going on. We had a lawyer on the channel explaining everything to us. Sounds like you don't need to be worried about Tyreek Hill this next season. With Tyreek, he was the wide receiver 3 from a points per game perspective a year ago. He averaged over 100 receiving yards per game. But if Tua would have stayed healthy, you can make an argument that Tyreek maybe would have been the wide receiver 1 overall. Because in the game that Tua actually played last year, those 13 contests, you had Tyreek Hill averaging 21 points per game. You had Tyreek Hill averaging 108 receiving yards per game, over 10 targets a game. And this is in comparison to the 4 games without Tua, where he was down there at 75.5 receiving yards a game, 15.5 points per game. I'm assuming that Tua plays this entire next season. I'm not worried about it. So I'm going to have Tyreek Hill at 3. Now, we will have Cooper Kupp at 4. And if you were looking at the 2 different drafting spots, really, like if you're in underdog best ball drafts, right, where it's pretty much where all the money's being drafted, at least this time of the year. I've already had millions of dollars of drafts get kicked off. There you're going to see Kupp and Tyreek really up in the air, and you don't really know who's going to go ahead of who. Whereas if you're looking at like a casual ESPN draft, you have Cooper Kupp with an ADP of 5, Tyreek Hill with an ADP of 8.5. So in your casual redraft league, most people are going to disagree with this. Most people are going to push Cooper Kupp ahead of Tyreek Hill. I just think that the talent of both receivers are very comparable. I think if you were looking at Tyreek Hill, he's going to be playing on a much better team. And if you look at the Miami Dolphins schedule, it is brutal. Like the Dolphins are going up against some of the best teams in the NFL this next season. So I think in general, you're going to get more passing volume in Miami than we should expect in Los Angeles. Kupp, however, back-to-back seasons from being a wide receiver 1, the wide receiver 1 overall from a points per game perspective. 2 years ago, he led the NFL in receiving yards, receptions, and receiving touchdowns. So I understand the people taking Kupp over Tyreek, right? I'm just a Tyreek Hill guy. Now, going over to our next guy, we are going to have Stefan Diggs. With Diggs, don't really have any concerns. I think he's just a super safe pick. He's had 3 straight seasons of being a top 10 wide receiver from a points per game perspective. I mean, he's averaging 2.4 yards per route run over the past 3 years. He's averaging 110 intended air yards per game. I mean, you really don't have a lot of target competition at all in Buffalo. You have the elite level quarterback play with Josh Allen. It's not like Stefan Diggs is too old, so just a really safe option, right? Now, our next guy was CeeDee Lamb. This is a wide receiver that is continuously getting better. If you were looking at Lamb, wide receiver 31 as a rookie, wide receiver 16 as a second-year player, and a wide receiver 7 this past season. He could have been even better if Dak Prescott would have stayed healthy. The games that Dak Prescott played, CeeDee Lamb actually averaged about 18.5 points per game. In comparison to the games that Dak Prescott missed, CeeDee Lamb was down at 16.5 points per game. So you could have seen that natural improvement for Lamb. Yeah, you bring over Brandon Cooks. In reality, Brandon Cooks should just help this overall offense. I mean, Cooks is just a field-stretching wide receiver at this point of his career. I don't expect him to see a lot of volume. I think CeeDee Lamb's going to be the target hog in this offense. But going over to our next guy, we are going to have A.J. Brown. With Brown, I think maybe you have more touchdown upside just because the Philadelphia Eagles obviously are going to be significantly better than the Dallas Cowboys. With A.J. Brown, this is a wide receiver that's averaged 2.7 yards per route run over the past 3 years. Really, the only reason I'm going to have A.J. Brown behind CeeDee Lamb, because if you're like in underdog drafts right now, A.J. Brown's actually going to go ahead of Lamb, is one, I mean, hell, Lamb had more points last year, right? I think that's something that we can point out. And two, A.J. Brown has to go up against Devonta Smith, someone we'll talk about later on in this video, as well as Dallas Goedert, where CeeDee Lamb doesn't really have any target competition. And on top of this, I mean, the Philadelphia Eagles are going to have way more rushing production than the Dallas Cowboys. So yeah, I know most people like on Underdog are taking A.J. Brown ahead of CeeDee Lamb. I think you make a strong argument for Lamb, to be honest. Now, going over to our next guy, very polarizing to rank. Devonte Adams is a wide receiver that over the past 3 seasons has averaged the wide receiver 3 finish from a points per game perspective. This is as high as only one other player in Tyreek Hill. You could make an argument over the past 4 to 5 seasons, Devonte Adams has been the best wide receiver in fantasy football. And yes, I understand I'm drafting him and I'm ranking him lower than any of his finishes previously down here at 8. And if you look at what you have in casual redraft leagues right now, Devonte Adams is actually going against the wide receiver 5 there, which is a little surprising to me, because if you're in those underdog drafts, Devonte Adams is going after Amon-Ra St. Brown. Devonte Adams is going after Garrett Wilson, which in my mind is a little bit crazy. Devonte Adams is the wide receiver 10 there. I'm taking him any day of the week. And what's also crazy about this is if you go and look at the underdog player props, they have Devonte Adams for 1,325 receiving yards. This is really only behind Justin Jefferson. I mean, they have Justin Jefferson at 1,395. I mean, they have Tyreek Hill for fewer yards than Devonte Adams. I mean, they have Jamar Chase for fewer yards than Devonte Adams. Hell, they have CeeDee Lamb for way fewer yards. They have A.J. Brown for way fewer yards. I like being high on Adams. I mean, if I'm able to get him as the wide receiver 10 in the second round of underdog drafts, I'm going to continuously smash that button over and over and over again. I'd recommend you do the same as well. And of course, real quick, if you want to get into the fantasy football draft today, you know, Best Ball Mania is already live on Underdog, has been for months. It's a $25 buy-in, $15 million prize pool. It's best ball, so there's no time commitment at all during the season. That's also where you can check out all those cool player props, and you can find the link in the description of this video in the comment section. If you sign up with promo code FLOCK, they're going to match your first deposit dollar for dollar up to $100. Plus, you'll get our 2023 fantasy football rankings, as well as a free trial to flockfantasy.com. Available in damn near every state. You can see the map here. We're going to be drafting there every single day on the live stream, not missing a day until 2024. But now let's go over to our next guy, where Garrett Wilson is someone that is obviously projected to take a massive step forward, right? Garrett Wilson, if you're looking at his end of season statistics, not too impressive. Wide receiver 31 from a points per game basis. Like, I understand why you'd be complaining, but if you break down his seasons with and without Zach Wilson, it's wild. Like, with Zach Wilson, Garrett Wilson only averaged 3.78 receptions per game, 49 receiving yards per game, and only 8.5 fantasy points per game. Whereas in games with no Zach Wilson, and it's not like you had elite quarterback play, it was Mike White and Joe Flacco, the man was over 17 points per game. The man was averaging over 11 targets per game. As a rookie, if we're going through and looking at rookies that have had comparable seasons to Garrett Wilson throughout history, you have guys like AJ Green, Jaylen Waddle, Mike Evans, Sammy Watkins, T. Higgins, Deshaun Jackson, Amari Cooper, Jeremy Maclin, Chris Olave, Michael Crabtree. You have a ton of very exciting options, plus a massive quarterback upgrade for Garrett Wilson. Now, it all depends on where you're drafting, right? Like, if you're having to take Garrett Wilson over Devonte Adams on Underdog, I honestly don't love it. But if you're in your like casual redraft format and you're going to be able to get Garrett Wilson at like the 2-3 turn in an ESPN draft, you better be drafting him there. Now going over to our next guy, we're going to be looking at Monroe St. Brown. Wide receiver 10 from a points per game perspective this past year is going to be that option closer to the line of scrimmage, right? I think you make an argument that Monroe St. Brown is much more exciting with the departure of TJ Hawkinson, where maybe their route tree overlapped just a little bit in terms of the area of the football field that they were working in on. You're never going to expect a massive season when it comes to touchdowns with Monroe St. Brown, but this is a wide receiver that could realistically lead the NFL in targets with the current trajectory that he's on. Now, our next guy, we're going to be looking at Jaylen Waddle. My most drafted wide receiver last year in underdog drafts, but that's when you're able to grab him as a low-end wide receiver 2, high-end wide receiver 3. Now it's much more difficult. Jaylen Waddle back-to-back seasons as that low-end wide receiver 1, high-end wide receiver 2. What you actually saw this past year is the volume go down, which is always extremely concerning, right? You don't want to see volume going down for any of your players, and you'd rather see the opposite. You would rather see efficiency possibly go down while volume goes up, and we can expect a massive bounce back. But, I mean, it makes sense. You add in Tyreek Hill, right? Of course, Tyreek Hill is going to be taking a ton of targets in this offense. And, of course, when you add in Tyreek Hill and Jaylen Waddle is not the number one guy there anymore, you're naturally going to get more efficient play overall. The entire offense is going to get better when you add in Tyreek Hill. I don't necessarily know if we have to explain that too much. And what's also interesting, if you're going to be going ahead and looking at Jaylen Waddle, is the split that you had with and without Tua. Very similar to what you had with Tyreek Hill, and this shouldn't surprise many people. Jaylen Waddle was much better in games that Tua played this past season than in the games where Tua missed. Jaylen Waddle averaged about 17 points per game with Tua and about 10 points per game without Tua. So if Tua stays healthy this next year, that's how you get the continued improvement from both Tyreek Hill as well as Jaylen Waddle, even if it seems a little unlikely on the surface. Now let's go over to someone who had an obnoxious rookie season. Chris Olave, wide receiver 27. I get it, kind of like Garrett Wilson, right? On the surface, not too good. But if you dive under the hood here with Chris Olave, this is a wide receiver that his rookie season comps to Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson, Odell Beckham Jr., Mike Evans, Keenan Allen, Julio Jones, and AJ Green. Wild. He had a 26% team target share as a rookie. He averaged about 70 receiving yards per game. He averaged 2.5 yards per route run. He averaged 122 air yards per game. You had literally everything you wanted from Chris Olave as a rookie. The only thing you didn't have was good quarterback play. He was dealing with like 35-year-old Andy Dalton. I'm not a big Derek Carr guy, but I'd imagine Carr is better than what you had this past season for Olave. And Olave is another one of these guys that is valued wildly different between like the high stakes best ball underdog community, right? Versus like the casual redraft community. If you're looking at ESPN ADP right now, Chris Olave is the wide receiver 16. You get Chris Olave in the 4th round of your ESPN drafts. Whereas if you were looking at underdog drafts, Chris Olave is the wide receiver 12 going in the middle of the 2nd round. And this is why y'all know usually I'm saying, okay, well, if you're in an underdog draft, you probably need to be going wide receiver round 1 because you're not going to be able to find middle round wide receiver values. Whereas if you're in like your casual redraft league, yeah, go with the running back round 1, go with an elite tight end like Travis Kelce round 1. Because if you're able to grab someone like Chris Olave at the end of the 3rd, in the beginning or middle of the 4th round, it's a legitimate cheat code. Now, going over to our next guy, we're going to be looking at T. Higgins, wide receiver 20 this past year, which wasn't great, right? But you have to remember, that's from a per game perspective where T. Higgins went out there and gave us the head fake in a few games last year. If y'all remember, and trust me, I remember well because I told a bunch of people to start T. Higgins when he was questionable. And then he goes out there, he plays 1 snap and stands on the sideline and looks pretty the rest of the game. He does literally nothing. So you kind of have to break down the T. Higgins season into a multitude of different ways. You have to look at the overall season and then remove the weeks where he played fewer than 30% of snaps. Because if he played fewer than 30% of snaps, pretty much like he didn't play those games. And if we do that, T. Higgins wasn't the wide receiver 20. He was the wide receiver 12, and it was back-to-back seasons for T. Higgins with him as the wide receiver 12, where he had a 22% team target share. I mean, hell, he was there at 76 receiving yards per game. It looked just very, very similar to that 2021 season. And obviously, I mean, hell, if you're in an elite level offense, we should be excited. But now going over to our next guy, we're going to be looking at Devonta Smith. Took that step forward this past year, 25% team target share in Philadelphia. Now, keep in mind, Dallas Goedert did miss the end of the season, and that did allow Devonta Smith to take that step up at the very end. But just a super talented wide receiver. You can make an argument that his final season at Alabama was one of the best collegiate wide receiver seasons that we've ever seen. He's in an elite level offense. If you go through and look at the comps of Devonta Smith going into year 3, he looks like CeeDee Lamb, T. Higgins, Terry McLaurin, Deebo Samuel, DK Metcalf. My favorite comp, Calvin Ridley. I really think Smith looks a lot like Ridley. We'll talk about Ridley in just one second. DJ Moore, Cooper Kupp, DeAndre Hopkins, T.Y. Hilton, Jeremy Maclin, Percy Harvin, Calvin Johnson, Andre Johnson. Like, the comps for Smith are great here going into year 3. Now, DK Metcalf, our next guy, I mean, he's averaged the wide receiver 20 finish over the past 3 years. Definite step backwards over the past 2 seasons. Like, honestly, if you just look at the numbers with Metcalf, it's hard to justify a ranking here knowing that, yeah, Tyler Lockett as well as JSN now in this offense. DK Metcalf just scares me, right? We've seen the elite level ceiling before, like back in 2020. The last thing I want to do is go and rank Metcalf significantly lower than consensus, and then he just comes out and lights the world on fire, right? And Metcalf is kind of a player I want to be neutral on. If you're looking at ESPN drafts, he's being drafted as the wide receiver 12. There he's going ahead of Higgins. He's going ahead of Devonta Smith. He's going ahead of Chris Olave. I agree with none of that, but I kind of agree with where he's going in underdog drafts, where there he's going as the wide receiver 15. Now, our next guy, Deebo Samuel, massive step backwards this past season. With Deebo Samuel, he goes from 3.1 yards per route run down to 1.8. He goes from 110 total yards per game down to 66. Like, Deebo Samuel is another one of these guys that, I mean, if you're looking at his finish from last year, it's hard to justify ranking him here, especially if you're looking at the splits with and without Christian McCaffrey. Like, it's a little scary when you're diving into Deebo Samuel here. And it makes sense because Christian McCaffrey is that hybrid player that honestly looks a lot like Deebo. Like, if you were to label CMC a wide receiver, Deebo Samuel a running back, like, there wouldn't be that much outrage over it. But the splits with and without CMC are a little stark. This is just kind of no man's land for a wide receiver, right? I think after you get past Higgins and Smith, you are going to see a significant drop-off. Now, going over to the next guy, we're going to be looking at Amari Cooper. And the more I dive into this, the more I want to actually rank Amari Cooper over Deebo as well as over DK Metcalf. And it may be something that we eventually do. What I'll probably wait to see is where DeAndre Hopkins signs. And if Hopkins goes anywhere but the Cleveland Browns, then at that point, we're probably going to be making Amari leapfrog the 2 guys in front of him. Finished as the wide receiver 18 from a points per game basis last year. Should have a significant quarterback upgrade with Deshaun Watson now. It's not like the man's too old by any means. So yeah, I mean, if you're looking at just him projecting as the wide receiver 1 for a Deshaun Watson offense, compared to Deebo Samuel with a lot of competition, compared to DK Metcalf with a lot of competition, I think you make an argument for Amari Cooper to be a little bit higher. We are just going to wait until we actually have news with DeAndre Hopkins. We'll talk about him in a second as well. But going over to our next guy, we're going to be looking at Christian Watson. I want to be all over Christian Watson. This is a wide receiver that saw an elite level breakout in the second half of the year this past season. I mean, the only wide receivers better than Christian Watson in the final 8 weeks were Jefferson, Lamb, Adams, Keenan Allen, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Devonta Smith, Chris Godwin, right? I mean, he was a top 10 wide receiver as a rookie. And we've seen this before from a big athletic wide receiver that goes out there and dominates with his touchdown rate. Like, Christian Watson scored a touchdown on over 10% of his targets this past season. That is 100% going to come back down to earth. There's no way he continues to score touchdowns at that clip. And we saw the same thing with Chase Claypool as a rookie, which initially in my mind, you should be a little bit nervous about. But why I'm not nervous for Christian Watson turning into Chase Claypool is his yards per route run. Christian Watson this past season was at 2.6 for his yards per route run. The only wide receivers ahead of him through all last year were Tyreek Hill, Justin Jefferson, A.J. Brown, Jaylen Waddle, Cooper Kupp, and then Christian Watson. So yeah, I'm going to assume Christian Watson is not turning into Chase Claypool primarily based on what we have with that one metric. Now, going over to our next guy, Calvin Ridley is someone that I wanted to be all in on this next season, right? But I've had a very difficult time drafting Calvin Ridley in underdog drafts because there Calvin Ridley is going as the wide receiver 16. And wide receiver 16 is going to be too rich of a price tag for me. Clearly, we have him down here, wide receiver 19, especially if you go through and look at the projections, like these are the player props on Underdog. They have Calvin Ridley at 855 receiving yards. I mean, hell, Godwin is over that. Godwin's at 925. Hell, Mike Evans is over that. Mike Evans is at 950. It's like very difficult to look at those projections and justify Calvin Ridley up there as like wide receiver 16. What's weird, though, is if you go over and look at Calvin Ridley in like casual ESPN redraft leagues, there Calvin Ridley is a round 6 pick, not a round 3 pick. There he's going as the wide receiver 25. So what I would say is if you're in those underdog drafts, I'm probably not taking Calvin Ridley in the middle of round 3. If you're in your casual redraft league, hell yes, go take Calvin Ridley in round 6 because this is someone that has a crap ton of upside. I mean, last time we saw him play a full season, he was a top 5 wide receiver playing alongside Julio Jones. And if you were to remove the 2 games where he played injured and played fewer than 70% of the snaps, he would have averaged 101 receiving yards per game and over 10 targets per game. He would have pretty much been the wide receiver 2 that season. So Ridley has a ton of upside. It's all about the price point you're drafting him at, though. Now, our next guy to lead off our following tier, Keenan Allen, will be much lower for me in best ball drafts than he's going to be in these full PPR leagues. Because with Keenan Allen, you're not going to really see those massive touchdown spike weeks, right? Keenan Allen doesn't really score touchdowns. Over the past 3 years, he's had a touchdown rate about 4.5%. I mean, he's just playing close to the line of scrimmage, right? You're not expecting big plays for Keenan Allen. He's going to be that target hog that's soaking up all the volume. And you'll love him in a full PPR format for that reason. But to be fair, this is someone that's gotten worse every single season. He's gone from wide receiver 7 to wide receiver 10 to wide receiver 12 now. He's gone from 10.5 targets per game down to 9.8, down to 8.9. I mean, it makes sense that he's declining. I mean, the man's going into pretty much year 10 of his NFL career. They add in a wide receiver in round 1. So in general, I'm going to be a little bit lower than Keenan Allen compared to consensus. I'm actually not really drafting him in underdog drafts or casual redraft leagues right now. But I think that's all I have for y'all. Again, thank you so much for checking out this video. If you enjoyed it, go down there, drop a like, subscribe to the channel if you play fantasy football. And if you want to get into a draft with us later today on the live stream or tomorrow or the day after that or the day after that, we're streaming every single day until 2024. We'll be streaming with those underdog fantasy drafts. Best ball, so no time commitment at all during the season. The same place where you can see all those cool player props. If you sign up with promo code FLOCK, they're going to match your first deposit dollar for dollar up to $100, as well as you'll get our 2023 fantasy football rankings, a free trial to flockfantasy.com. Since it's best ball, there's no time commitment during the year. It's how I drafted over 700 teams and won $150,000 last season on Underdog. But I think that's all I have for you. Again, thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. Really hope you have a great day, and I really hope we get to see you in a live stream later today.